Welcome back to another week of Let's Discuss with Meg Duke, where we discuss some things perinatal and all things mental health. I am so excited. I have said it before. I have meant it before for other people, and we have learned so much together in our year and a half journey of this podcast. This is the one that comes back so much over and over again. So I am so excited. Natashia, she is a licensed marriage and family therapist and is nationally certified sex therapist through the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. They are a doctoral student in human sexuality at California Institute of Integral Studies and have served as an adjunct faculty at CIIS and the Wright Institute, and currently work in private practice in Northern California. Committed to the development of social justice, Natashia's lens is working as a sex therapist is informed by feminist and queer theories and somatic and relational orientations psychotherapeutically, which I am so excited to talk about all of that. Natashia sees individuals and couples in private practice and has several groups, including Living Room, Mother's Meditation, and Conversational Mindfulness-Based Support Group, and 2 ongoing feminist sexuality process groups. Natashia has been a featured writer and speaker in publications, podcasts, movies, and blogs, including the documentary film, The Business of Being Born, and the books, The Ultimate Guide to Sex Through Pregnancy and Motherhood, and Nurturing the Family, A Doula's Guide to Supporting New Parents by Jackie Kelleher. Natashia's research is focused on long-term intimacy building as sexual fluidity during the life cycle is processed parallel to the processing of privilege, oppression, and social status. And this will be in the show notes. You can find more about her offerings at natashiamft.com. Welcome. Thank you so much for taking your time to talk about everything that I just talked about in detail. I'm so excited to have you.
I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for reaching out to me. And it's also really amazing what you're doing, Meg, and what you're offering community on a very consistent and wide range basis.
Thank you. That means so much to hear. That I appreciate that very much. Yeah, I did. I actually reached out to another sex therapist who I met through another podcast guest, and he was like, "I'm not the one you want. This is the person you want." And so then I was like, "Hi, hello, please join me." And you were kind enough to say yes.
Oh, well, I'm grateful. Yeah, I'm excited.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So tell me, how did you decide to become an MFT?
Okay, well,
Take us back.
just moving right into it. So, therapy is so interesting, right? And I think people have a lot of different roads that they take to go to become a therapist. For me, I had a couple of careers prior to becoming a licensed therapist. But I think my training really began during my college years in the early 90s, when the nurse practitioner at City College of New York in Harlem invited a group of students to train us to be peer health and sex educators and counselors.
Oh, wow.
And that was phenomenal work and really a kind of start for me on both understanding sexuality through a counseling lens and then understanding counseling and the wide reach of what sexuality actually might mean in people's lives. And then I had about 12 years where I worked as a doula. And for some of that time, I also was a comprehensive sex educator and counselor with the Children's Aid Society, and then later consulting, writing curricula, and training staff at different nonprofits in New York City to become comprehensive sex educators for the populations they were working for. During that time, I did an incredible amount of, training, but also counseling. People were dealing with a lot of vicarious trauma. As a doula, training other doulas, working with childbirth educators, lactation consultants, midwives, I was hearing a lot of vicarious trauma
Mm-hmm.
And because of my background, people started coming to me for short-term counseling.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then the final part of your answer is um, I started having chronic pain issues in my feet because of a disability that I'm acquiring as I'm aging.
Mm-hmm.
And so realizing that, I wouldn't be able to sustain doula work for the later years in my life, I realized, okay, so I've always wanted to continue learning. What's something that I can do that I think I can do well? And this led me to becoming a licensed therapist.
Wow, that's amazing. And what an interesting thing that you were talking about the nurse practitioner having you all become peer
Mm,
health and sex educators. I
yeah.
mean, that's so exciting to hear that people are taking that seriously and finding ways for people to support each other. And then, of course, that now led us to right here in this very moment where we're talking to each other.
Yeah, and if I may say, it's hitting me like the work you're doing, the work she was doing. And in some ways, also, I really think about this with the work I'm doing, particularly in groups.
Mhm, mm,
Adrienne Marie Brown talks about emergent strategies,
mhm,
ways of really working towards social wellness, kind of from the ground up. And
mhm.
I think that I started learning more about emergent strategies during that time in the 90s and kind of hope to never stop.
Yes. Oh, lifelong learner. Absolutely. Yes,
An
absolutely.
activist.
Yes, and that I was going to say I am very excited to have that conversation too. We can have it now. We'll probably have it throughout, but talking about like the places of privilege upon which I sit, and I see some of the numbers about like people of color who give birth,
Mhm.
specifically Black people of color who are birthing people, and I don't know. I not to sound hopeless and dark, but like I just never feel like I'm doing enough, or like what are things that a lot of us just kind of sit here like we know it's a problem,
Mhm.
what can we do? And so that's what it's nice to be able to have some conversations like this, the people who are on the ground running, to be able to help other people understand, to give a voice to it, to share, to showcase what's happening, and then, if there are things that we can do to support as well.
Mhm. Mhm. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I think what might be good is for us, because it's a great and very broad question,
Mhm.
right? And
Yeah.
so if I can keep that question in mind, which I'm really hearing as how do we deal with issues related to privilege and social status,
Hmm.
as well as marginalized identities,
Hmm.
as we're going through our own lives, and in many cases, I think with the populations listening to this, parenting journeys.
Hmm. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So walk me through a little bit more while we're going through the history. How did you decide to focus on somatic sex therapy? What was that jumped out and was like, this is my trajectory?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, we all have bodies,
We
right?
sure do.
And it seems to me like, as someone who really likes to think, I I absolutely adore engaging with the front brain, the neocortex, which is the intellectual part of our brains.
Hmm.
And my body has taught me a lot about how its presence knows a lot as well. And sometimes what my body is saying to me is in alignment with what I think, and sometimes it's really not. And there's always wisdom in those spaces.
Yes.
And so a kind of therapy which doesn't pay serious homage to our soma,
Hmm.
to me, is really short-sighted. Might develop some kind of intellectual insight, but I'm not sure that it's really that holistic.
Hmm.
The
Hmm.
other piece is relational. The way we develop a sense of self is always in relationship to other.
Yes, sure.
And so the way we get injured or experience shame, like experiencing shame rather, that's in relationship to other. As Sonia Renee Taylor lets us know, we aren't born with shame.
Yes.
Inherit that. And so the way towards healing and social wellness is really relationally.
Yeah.
So that's like, for me, somatic therapy that brings the body into the experience of what is healing and what is being communicated, as well as what's happening between either myself and the client relationally, or within the group or between the couple. That relationship process in the here and now moments is extremely rich. Is where healing can be actually felt in our soma in the moment. And then when we experience that healing, we can have that transition into what we experience outside the therapy room.
Wow, absolutely. I love that. I love to be able to recognize every aspect of it, not just like you were saying, the I can't talk. The intellect piece of it, intellectualization. Yeah. What is going on with my mouth today? Okay, anyway, of it all, which is certainly an important conversation, but then also too recognizing like when you're sitting with that tension and like, what is my body trying to tell me? I say that a lot. I feel like I say that a lot to people, clients, and my students I teach over at the University of Kansas, and like, what is my body trying to tell me? What am I supposed to take from this? Instead of trying to dampen it or dull it, or I shouldn't feel this way or ignore it, utilizing that and sitting in the present space and being able to say like, where do we go from here? And so that's interesting to hear that. And can you tell me more too? I know I mentioned in your bio about the feminist and queer theories under which you operate sometimes. Can you share a little more about that as well?
Sure. I suppose it might really make sense to share. When I was earlier I'm trying to figure out how to kind of encapsulate this, and I think this might be a good segue. When I was doing doula work and I was asked to be filmed in Ricky Lake's The Business of Being Born, that was really interesting because I had already in my my collegial doula group and perinatal professional world, what was happening in the context of that film, we were all very much and feminists had been working towards reproductive justice for a long time, piecing together that capitalism and neoliberalism uses sexuality to really control people. And part of using sexuality to control people absolutely is the medical industrial complex and impacting how and where and the kinds of experiences people are having as they're pregnant, giving birth, and postpartum. And as you mentioned earlier, so adversely impacting femme bodies and of femme bodies, women of color, and of women of color, Black women in particular, 3 to 4 times more likely to either die or have major trauma during their birthing experiences. And this is systematic, it's structural, it's huge. And that's where the idea of emergent strategies and how can we work, like little by little, and in relationship together. So that's kind of bringing in both queer theories and feminist theory. Feminist neither of those theories are, am I going to do a good job encapsulating to explain, but feminist relationality
Mhm.
is very, very significant for me in terms of how do we recognize our differences
Right.
and how do we find a way to relate with each other, not pretending that we're the same,
Mm.
really acknowledging the differences that we have and what our life experiences are, and that we can care about each other and we can work together for greater social well-being.
You're
And
right.
in queer theory, in a very short way, for the sake of this podcast.
I mean, obviously, people can major in queer theory
Yes,
across a
exactly.
life. So we're yes, yes.
Right.
Just
But the significance of saying
Mhm,
normativities,
yeah,
like for instance,
yes.
giving birth in a hospital with an OB today is a normativity.
Mhm,
That is structurally that way. And the kinds of interventions that structurally happen, they're
mhm,
not happening because that is the safest thing
mhm,
for
mhm.
the person's body who is in labor. They're happening because economically it works for the systems.
Yes.
And so queering notions of what's normative to say, wait a second, what's happening to marginalized bodies? And what can we do to actually create greater social wellness centering marginalized bodies?
Mhm.
So that's kind of like those kinds of issues are pretty consistently um, my orientation and way of thinking about whatever subjects we're talking
Yes.
about.
Yes. Well,
Mhm.
I really, again, I can't say it enough. People spend 4 years in a bachelor's and then a master's, and you can do a PhD and all of this, and much more than we have the time to
Yeah.
chat today. But I appreciate you letting people kind of understand how that colors your vantage point and the way that you interact with people. And I liked how you talk. Again, we talk a lot about trusting the person to be the expert in their own life. And I also really, you didn't use the expression colorblind, but like not being colorblind, like, oh, we're all the same. Oh, we're all human. No, we're not all the same. And let's acknowledge that and let's celebrate that and then make sure that we're making choices based on those differences moving
Mhm.
forward. So I really appreciate you kind of giving
Mhm.
us a little more insight into that, because I mean, I could sit here and talk to you for the next couple hours about it, but we'll so I know this is kind of what I reached out to you in the beginning, and certainly continue to morph in the conversation we're having, but I have so many listeners who've sent me messages, clients, obviously hip, I'm not going to give too many any details, but just talking about they kind of struggle to feel themselves in their own bodies after having given birth. What does that look like? What is something that you found in your experience that's been helpful for people to not necessarily try to get back to their old body, and don't get me started on how I feel about bounce back culture, but um how do people work to recognize the things that your body is telling you now? What is it like in this new body that has done this extraordinary thing? How do you feel comfortable? How do you find comfort in that space?
Mhm. Yeah, very important question. And I think it's really interesting that you even touched upon this notion of like, when will I get my body back?
Mhm,
Um,
mhm, mhm.
is so commonly so common in our culture. When will we feel like ourselves again?
Mhm.
Uh, and also terminology like 9 months on, 9 months off.
Yes, yes.
Um, if we kind of slow down a little bit, talking about the perinatal time period. So perinatal, conception, pregnancy, birth, the immediate postpartum, and then the postpartum years, which I really think are like 2 to 3 years. Um, if we say, the perinatal time period, that's a transitional time period in our lives.
Mhm.
And that's kind of interesting. What are other transitional time period time periods in our lives. Well, puberty is one, right?
Mhm.
And as adults, we've gone through puberty. So what do we know about puberty? Well, puberty, we could say, is like a 2 to 4 year process, right? So that's
Mhm.
another transitional time period.
Mhm.
The defensive part of me quickly says, would anybody say to a 15-year-old, when are you going to get your body back?
Yep. Yep.
Would anyone say to a 15-year-old, why don't you just act the way you acted when you were 10?
Amazing. I've never thought of it this way. This is beautiful. Oh my gosh. Yes, go ahead. Sorry. I'm just so excited about this.
Okay, right. And you know, it I see, like, imagining someone saying that to your 15-year-old self. No. And I know that with my teenagers, it's a really sensitive time period. Even after the majority of the physical changes have
Mhm.
happened, it's such an emotional and unknown. And that brings me to a little bit of what we can learn from our infants.
Mhm.
Babies are going through a transitional time period
Mhm.
of being born. When a baby is, looking around, they're just getting a sense of their body, and they're learning what their hand is, they're learning what they can do. Even a toddler is learning no. And that is so significant, because to be able to say no, you know what your yeses are.
Yes.
So, I think that as we're going through the postpartum time period, it can be so daunting
Mhm.
because we're not grounded. We're in transition. We're learning what putting our feet on the ground means,
Mhm.
and we're exhausted.
Mhm.
And that's par for the course. And so, the notion that it shouldn't be that way, or that we should be ready to go back to work and be as productive as we were before we had the most major responsibilities we've ever had in our entire lives,
Mhm.
it really doesn't make sense to me,
Yeah.
you know? So,
Absolutely.
so if someone comes in and they say to me, like, I feel awful,
Mhm.
and I just want to feel like I felt before, what they're saying to me is that they're grieving. And
Mhm.
grieving makes absolute sense, because
Mhm.
life is not as simple as it was 2 years ago.
Right.
It's totally different, and it will never be like that again.
Mhm.
And we need to be able to grieve as we're transitioning, so that as that's processed,
Mhm.
we also can process the incredible place we might be in,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
It's really a process. And I
Mhm.
think for therapists or anyone working with parents who are in the early years of parenting, the work is really around holding space and normalizing
Mhm.
how messy and complicated this transitional time period is, and just caring.
Right. Absolutely. I appreciate you saying that so much. I love likening it to puberty, because it is something, it is a change that you can't go back to. Uh, that's the before, and this is the now. And you're right, because it would just sound frankly absurd for somebody to say, well, why don't you just act like you were when you were 10 before this happened? And so, but that expectation on birthing people is not there. The expectation is, I had a guest on a couple episodes ago that talked about like MILF culture, right? And it's like, what do we do as women, generally like the feminine form, so that people think that we're worthy of having sex with? And
Mhm.
so after that's what comes back to the bounce back culture too, of like, oh, you got to snap back into that. I saw recently something popped up on my internet that said, um, 20 before and after actresses and their bodies and amazing transformations. And I'm like, why is this even something that we're putting energy into, as though there's anything wrong with somebody else who didn't make an amazing transformation, air quotes. And so I love the idea of this puberty thing, because that was a real tangible way for me to describe that to people in a way that really helps to normalize, like, no, and that's okay. And you can grieve it, and you can be sad about some of the things and the freedoms and the other things that happened before that aren't there anymore. And also, let's acknowledge where we are now.
Yeah. One other thing that I really love learning about, like using those whom were around during the perinatal time period to teach us.
Mm-hmm.
You know, with babies, we use terminology like overstimulated,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's such a real thing, being
Mm-hmm.
overstimulated.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And parents get incredibly overstimulated
Yes.
by all that is coming at them. And really like learning to help people realize when they're feeling overstimulated, and then working on tools. When we're overstimulated, it's like way too much at once.
Mm-hmm.
And we need some space to kind of like come back into our soma and feel. Even recognizing the way too much is such a fantastic recognition.
Yes.
And to use that recognition to create spaces where we can ground, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah. And then let's see, there was something else that you just said. Oh, I think I might have lost it. Anyway,
Well, if you think
it
about
will
it,
come back.
I would say if you think about it, hop it right back in there, because I'd love to talk more about that. Well, I really appreciate that, because I think that just the more normalization, the less of the expectation, the societal expectation, the social media expectation, the more you don't have to be the insert supermodel here of it all. Your body is your body, and it did an amazing thing. And let's figure out how we do feel comfortable in it moving forward. Like you said, getting back into the soma, recognizing the stimulation, the overstimulation. Absolutely.
Can I
Similar.
say one thing, Meg?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Um, I think that's what I wanted to touch upon, was how do we recognize the soma, and
Mm-hmm.
isolating it can be to kind of notice your own stretch marks, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and feel your labia swollen, you
Mm-hmm.
know, be leaking when you're
Yes.
in a business meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that part of the amazing invitation that we have is figuring out where and how to develop community,
Yes.
where there's a normalization that's occurring related to exactly where we are and what is going on for us,
Mm-hmm.
not these imposed images of what things should be like.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really like one of the most golden things I think I might be able to share.
Mm-hmm.
Being with other parents who are really understanding the cloud of this time period
Mm-hmm.
and all of its nuances. I mean, it's why, teenagers, the psychologically, we know that during the teenage time period, the first family really becomes the social circle that they have.
Mm-hmm.
Their family at home is very significant, but during the teenage years, they're really spending much more time with their social network, because that network is in the same cloud that they're in and
Yes.
understands those nuances.
Yes.
And during the perinatal time period and other major life transitions like
Mm-hmm.
perimenopause and the death and dying process, those having people who are also going through that, where you can process together, is infinitely grounding.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I speaking for myself, I had a child and then 8 months later quarantine started. And so and we had also in that same time moved to Kansas City from Texas. So I genuinely can't imagine what I would have done and what my mental health journey would have looked like during that time had I not had a number of text groups of people who had kids in similar ages or older ages who had been there before and kind of had known some of the things, because that isolation that we all felt, no matter what your season of life was during quarantine, was compounded exponentially by the fact that, okay, well, now they're starting to walk. What am I supposed to do here? And, and then I had another baby during quarantine time. So absolutely. So it is so helpful, and it can be difficult. Like, how do you make friends? What do you, but to be able to find more of those spaces, and it is why I'm happy that places like social media do exist in certain places that do help us to feel normalized. And as terrifying and as hurtful as social media can be, also having some of the spaces that really invite people to feel held and seen are useful as well.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So I wanted to jump in from that, kind of again trying to feel like yourself after birth physically, but kind of the sexual component of it, because I've had a lot of people as well, they're saying the idea of having sex doesn't feel as enticing. It could be scary. I don't feel like myself, again, all of that. What are some things that you have found that have been helpful or useful, or anything that your experiences have shown you in that area?
Well, I think it's helpful to really think about if you've heard or I've heard that penetrative sex can feel scary. I think that it can be helpful to really consider that. And let me get graphic and flip the lens for a minute, okay?
Please. Yes.
And add context. So if a man pooped 8 to 9 pounds of poop in one go.
Okay.
An 8 to 9 pound poop would be really large coming out of the anus.
Yes. Yes.
That would be a tremendous, I know it probably sounds gross. It's not a baby, but that's that would be such a tremendous feat. And if that man enjoyed anal play, I would bet that there would be some time period where he was relating to his anus in a very different way than prior to the 8 to 9 pound poop.
Yes.
And that suddenly anal play, or even maybe just being sexual, would really feel different in his body, and would bring up a whole host of different things. Like he might remember pooping the 8 to 9 pound poop. He might have early childhood memories of poop experiences. He might also have fond memories of anal play with his partners. Like a whole mezcla, a whole combination.
Right.
Different kinds of thoughts and feelings would probably come in. And if he was starting to get into sexual play, he might even have a moment where he gets greatly overwhelmed because all these images or thoughts are coming in, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I think this is essentially what people who have given birth are dealing with, right?
Yes,
absolutely.
absolutely.
And I think their partners are often dealing with all of these changes as well. And it's something that we don't talk about enough. Like there's this storyline that we hold in our culture that the person who gives birth is scared to have sex or has no sex drive, and the partner is ready and wanting to go back to what it was before and doing their patient this to wait until,
Yes.
mom or partner's ready. So what we aren't talking about is how partners have grown up objectifying breasts and vaginas, maybe anuses too. And, objectifying them for their sexual play.
Right.
And like the function is their sexual play of those objects.
Right.
And suddenly during the perinatal time period, partners start to have a different relationship with the breasts, with the vagina, maybe also the anus. And then during birth and postpartum, the function of the vagina, of the muscles of the anus, and of the breasts all develop a felt difference. And it has absolutely nothing to do with their body or their sexual pleasure as they had thought about sexual pleasure before or been raised to think about it.
Right.
And so, there's a very big thing that's happening in terms of reconceptualizing sexuality.
Yes.
And I think we see this certainly during puberty. Sexuality is kind of thought to be developing, right? First times. During perimenopause and later in life, we see that sexuality absolutely is existent for many people, not talked about as much as I wish it was, but that it comes in different forms. It's not the sexuality of the late teens or 20s or early 30s. Is not that sexuality. It's so much more expansive.
Right.
But we really have to get into a mindset of discovering what is sexuality at this time, because now we're in a transition, and we may want some of the things that we did before. And we also might feel really different with our body parts. Like maybe breasts are off limit right now. But oh my gosh, the small of my back or my inner thighs or your arm around me, like just really playing and experimenting. And I think that's where we lose a lot, because we've got to kind of like get it in our heads. This is going to be new and different.
Yes.
And there might be some sorrow, and there might be some not even realizing I had an expectation. We need a lot of communication. Consent is totally working anew now.
Right.
And guess what? We don't know if we have 5 minutes to talk right now or an hour, because who knows when the baby is going to wake up. So all the processing has to happen in these like tiny little chunks. And something parents can do prior to giving birth, prior to even conceiving, is really learn how to talk with each other about their preferences and also about their no's and how they feel saying no to each other and how they feel saying maybe to each other. And just regularly being in conversation around desire, around pleasure, around lack of, and learning how to tolerate. I am not going to be able to give you everything. And that's also not my job. And oh my gosh, this was such a great moment that we could have that discussion.
Yes.
It feels really good to me. And now I kind of want to hug you.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like learning how to use emotional intimacy to create playful space. And thinking about sex, Audre Lorde, in Uses of the Erotic, Power of the Erotic, reclaimed sexuality, and in part symbolized doing that through titling it Life Force Energy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's so much to learn about thinking about our sexuality as our life force,
Mm.
where our energy is and how we can share our energy. And here's the thing. Sometimes that energy is really positive and playful and pleasurable.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes being able to exchange how upset we are or how, difficult this is and be really held in that, that's
Mm-hmm.
also a share of life force energy.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Oh my goodness. That is just such a beautiful way of looking at all of that. It's something that we just don't learn. I don't feel, I mean, I'm a social worker, I have a degree. I feel like now my husband, God bless him, he'll be like, "No, he knows you're married to a social worker." But I don't even feel like some of those things are people that they don't even think to have those conversations. It's just, this is what we do. And I'm a man and I'm heterosexual. So your boobs are supposed to turn me on and I'm supposed to wait my 6 weeks until you're done. And then I'm going to have it's just very that, and all of these layers that you're describing to it that are so meaningful for people to contemplate. I agree with you, certainly even before the baby comes, before you even start trying to have a baby, so that you could understand. I really liked what you were saying about feeling comfortable saying no, feeling comfortable saying maybe, getting in that space where you can feel that this is a safe space for me to explore and also a safe space for me to hold my boundaries. Um, very much that, yes.
And I can share with you a little hormonally why that's so significant in terms of pleasure,
Mhm.
which might be helpful for listeners. And then if you can help me after I do that, I'd really like to talk about bonding and difference and social status.
Okay, yes.
Let's like pin that for a minute.
Yes.
But so the hormone piece, um, a great parallel to this is labor. So
Mhm.
to drive, we need contractions that are getting longer, stronger, and closer together
Mhm.
for our cervix to open and for us to complete first stage labor.
Mhm.
And the hormone that drives the strength and duration and frequency of contractions is oxytocin.
Mhm.
Oxytocin is very, very interesting because as it's just starting to build up in early labor, for it to build up, our stress hormones have got to be very low.
Mhm.
If our stress hormones are high, catecholamines, adrenaline, norepinephrine, if they're high, then what happens is it kind of closes the door on oxytocin. We're not going to go into labor because the body is realizing conditions are not safe for me to
Right.
go into labor.
Right.
So we need to have low stress hormones and be able to kind of like get in a zone for oxytocin to start increasing, increasing, increasing. As active labor hits, oxytocin has increased enough that we can now have some more stress and it's okay. And we can also tolerate more pain because with each contraction, we're starting to have endorphins
Mhm.
released at the end. So now we can deal with more pain in a way that wasn't happening before. And for folks who had Pitocin,
Mhm.
they will probably know that this was not true for them because Pitocin goes from 0 to 100 and your body doesn't have the chance to hormonally deal with this.
Regulate. Yeah.
So this also happens for us sexually.
Mhm.
Well, birth, I believe, is a sexual experience, but in a context of being romantic sexually,
Yes.
when we are kind of realizing what it is that we're wanting and how it might go down and what the terms are, we're
Mhm.
developing conditions for safety so that our stress hormones can lower and our oxytocin can start to build. And then
Mhm.
guess what? As it builds more and more, all of a sudden we can get a little rougher with our play or experience a little bit more intensity with our play because
Mhm.
the oxytocin is higher and so are the endorphins. And that's why kind of like often the rhythm will be like start out somewhat slow and then build up, and it gets more intense. But when you're starting, you've got to feel safe to say no.
Yes.
Got to
Yeah.
feel safe to know. If you're worried about saying no, it's very hard to experience a buildup of oxytocin, which means it's hard to experience desire or pleasure because your body is saying no, you're not safe to say no.
Wow. I have no, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I have never put those two processes in that same kind of trajectory before, and that makes so much sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
I can come to that other point now.
Yes. Bonding, I wrote it down. Bonding and difference in social status. Yes.
Okay. So in our society, we do very little to help people deal with difference. In fact, we create identities to help people recognize similarity or sameness
Mhm.
and be attracted to that. And we also create like rupture between groups of different identities, which keep them farther apart. And there's a lack of bonding.
Right.
And to be able to feel bonded, one of the things that we really have to do is what we were just talking about,
Mhm.
create room for difference.
Yes.
And so when you know I am interacting with someone and I'm realizing, wow, we really have different social status. You know, I'm a white woman and I might be speaking with a person of color. It's very significant for me in my role, in my privileged role there, to really understand that while some of the things are really exciting to me that we're talking about, we're both relating about being moms, for instance, and maybe, you know, in the same time of parenthood.
Mhm.
It's very significant for me to not do that thing where I just pretend the differences don't exist.
Right.
For me to make space to really listen
Mhm.
and learn about what she or they are experiencing and not be afraid to ask questions and also not be afraid to share related to my privileges and notice that that might be different or have a different feeling. And the
Mhm.
more that we can connect like IRL, like really
Mhm. Mhm.
on who we each are and make space for the tension of differences,
Mhm.
we're going to be able to bond.
Right.
And in that way, we're going to be able to more truly be able to be supportive or understand what support means. Um,
Yeah.
and so I think I wanted to say that because first of all, there's just so much of a lens of kind of either equalizing everything, which is such a disservice. We are
Right.
not all having the same experience.
Mhm.
And also there's not enough of models for how to sit in the tension of difference and be curious.
Yes.
Curious within ourselves. And to the extent that someone wants to share with us, curious about them.
Mhm.
And so, you know, I'm giving that example as like two moms talking, but I think we could also say that can happen between a biological gestational parent and the partner.
Mhm. Yeah.
That those kinds of differences and curiosities are really significant for bonding.
Mhm. Yes. Absolutely. It's so important. I end my show every time with "Be curious, not judgmental," and I think that is obviously I think it's important because I say it every time. But I just think that this thing of like, if our first reaction is judgment, That
Yeah.
is something that is honestly systemically programmed into us. We're trained to think that we're better than others and so on and so forth in certain many ways. And then also too, it's something that can be changed if that's your goal, is to seek to live in a more curious space, to recognize, okay, I just made a judgment. Let's take a step back. One maybe instead of putting that as other or wrong, trying to learn more about how it came to be, what makes that important to you, how does that help you function in your life, and asking those questions again, as you said, though, making sure it's if they're willing and interested in participating in that journey with you in that conversation, and how helpful that can be.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess one other thing I would say about judgment that I really have learned personally is a lot of the time that I experience judgment, feeling judgmental, if I really ask myself, what does that thing have to do with me?
Yes.
I get much more to the root. Instead of focusing on the other person, I end up realizing how I can relate to whatever I'm being judgmental about and how it's a wound that I have. And so I wish they wouldn't do it, because if they didn't do it, it wouldn't hurt me so much for me to realize I do it too.
Yes, yes, absolutely that. And I will also say the other thing that I've noticed a lot too in a lot of podcasts and things that I've been listening to, we just have people who recognize other people living their lives authentically and things that make them happy, and we can't have that. We want to allow ourselves to have that, or society, the group that we're in sees that as other or bad, and so we have that jealousy of like, well, I'm not allowed to live so freely and authentically, so no one else should be allowed to live freely and authentically. And it's like, focus that energy back into yourself, figure out what it is that's got you going on about it, and use that in a way that's positive for yourself versus being judgmental or trying to oppress somebody else's freedom and authentic self.
Very, very important point. And I actually was reading for my dissertation work about clinical, and it's a scholarly book called Clinical Encounters in Sexuality. And one of the ways in which desire is talked about is that it's productive. And so if we're experiencing something like envy, there's actually desire there. And like you're saying, rather than shutting it down or being jealous, in a negative context, how can we be productive in noticing like, oh, wow, this is something that actually, there's something about that freedom that that person has, or the way they're allowing themselves to express, that I'm totally attracted to. And I want to experience some of that. That's being in touch with your life force energy and your creativity, and bringing you into places where there's like desire for generative expansion.
Right. Yes.
Desire is not always, and doesn't have to be thought of as something that's lacking that wants to be fulfilled. It can totally be thought of and experienced as something that's productive and generative.
Yes.
For our fullness and our process in being.
Wow. I love that. I got to tell you, I can't wait to listen to this episode again. And we just did. We just recorded it, but I'm so excited to listen to it again. You have such a great gift for the metaphor or the analogy of things that make things just kind of click. Like, oh, if you look at it that way, you can relate to this thing, and therefore you can also relate to another. And so it's just been such a pleasure to be able to utilize your experience and your expertise in a way that I think is going to help people feel like they have something kind of not necessarily tangible, but something kind of actionable to move forward with. Like, that made sense to me, and that might be how I reframe that moving forward to make it make more sense in my life.
Yeah. I think you're saying something here that is really important, because I'm not giving people like, do these 3 steps and you will solve your problem.
Right.
I think that's totally counterproductive.
Yeah.
I do not believe in that whatsoever. And in some ways that might be frustrating,
Mm.
but I guess I want to just, I think we're wrapping up, and I want to just say, I really don't think it's helpful for people to think of changes in desire and changes in our bodies as pathological. They're not problems. The
Yes.
body is giving us invitations. And
Yes.
the more we can really work relationally with what's happening in our minds and with our bodies, that's where we make love.
Mm. Mm.
We need to, I guess like one other piece that I didn't touch upon is people of different social statuses are going to have different access to creating time and space
Yes.
for self,
Mhm.
for self with baby, for parents together with baby or babies, and then also for parents together without kids. Like that takes a lot of resources and it takes a lot of time.
Mhm.
So there's a kind of patience
Mhm.
of sitting in the mess and in the complexity and in the lack of resolve that is very necessary. And it's really not the same for people of different classes or
Right.
geographies.
Absolutely right. Well, somebody on one of my previous episodes was like, we don't all have the same 24 hours. Like Kim Kardashian has 24 hours and Beyonce has 24 hours and I have 24 hours, and people like I don't have access to some of the things that they do. And I certainly have the privilege of having access to extensively more than other people. And so being able, once again, to not be judgmental and recognize what other people may be going through, and also recognize that that's a very important piece of that. Yes. It's funny that you mentioned that too. I actually have said to clients before, like, if I could give you a checklist of things to go do over the next week, and then you came back next week and we made some tweaks, and then it's like, yay, I'm magically fixed. Like, I'd love to put myself out of a job, but unfortunately, it's just, that's not how it works. And it really is about changing the way that we're intentional about recognizing living in the here and now in the present. Like you said, a lot getting back into the soma, recognizing different ways of thinking about things and having different vantage points. Yeah.
Yeah. What's the invitation for partners during that time period? And
Mm-hmm.
it's not an invitation to go back to the way things were before. And
Yes.
it also does not have to mean that it's not sexy or, there's a lack of sexiness or anything like that, but really questioning like, what's the invitation of our romantic partnership right now?
Yeah. Amazing. I cannot thank you enough for taking the time for this. Like I said, I'm already ready to re-listen to this as I edit it. I am so delighted to be able to share this information with our listeners. Where can everybody find you?
Well, that's a good question. Probably the most reliable source is my website and contacting me through my website. And that's natashia.mft.com, natashia.mft.com. Um, yeah.
Okay. Amazing. Amazing. I can't thank you enough. To everyone out there, I hope you took some time to really listen to this, listen to it again if you need to pick up on some of the other things that we discussed. But everyone out there, be curious, not judgmental. Goodbye.